Hello, I'm going to talk about some strange stuff today. I've been thinking strange stuff over the past few weeks, and puzzling over stuff as I generally do in my spare time, if I'm not playing computer games or something. And so here it is, a little bit social justice warrior queries and prophecies, and things like that, basically. So that's what I'll be talking about. I don't know quite how the things link together, but I'm just going to state them, and you can see what you think. It's going to sound kind of irrational, I think. So be it. Now, we're in a society at the moment where the left in particular are not really even just extremists, but even medium leftists and beyond, are no longer really doing what is in the interests of ordinary people. Instead, they're pushing really for the demolition of our civil rights in the name of so-called social justice. And indeed, I'll be circumspect about some of the things I say today, because our freedom of speech is already partly deleted, isn't it? So you get the people, lunatics frankly, going on about how everybody has to use the right pronouns, and so on and so forth, right? And yeah, we do. I mean, this is just common politeness. The problem is when these idiots try and enforce it. And also, we have groups well funded by organisations based on money from Soros and apparently deep state actors, secret services and so on, of various countries, following kind of the same agenda, slandering people who they don't like and destroying their careers, defaming them. Even organisations whose name claims that they are anti-defamation, in fact use defamation as a weapon against their enemies. And in fact we have a society in which the names of organisations in fact cover up what they really are like anti-fascist, supposedly, and yet their methods are fascist. So they are not anti at all. It's like ordinary people kind of just hear about them on the news and they hear the name and they assume it relates to what they really do, whereas the name is just a name. I think the Bolsheviks were among the first to use this technique in modern times. In Russia, I think it meant something like the Popular Party. Yeah, right. And then they were so popular they had to use force and mass executions to make everybody agree with them. Yeah. We're also in a world in which 8 million children go missing every year. That's 22,000 a day. It's 1 in 2,000 children a year, roughly speaking. And with the likes of the Savilleses and the Epsteins and people like that around, I think we know what's happening to them. And yet the authorities cover it up, fail to prosecute. Every now and then they'll throw some celebrity to the wolves, okay, and we'll find out what that person was doing. But other influential people are not touched until after their death, and sometimes it's revealed that what they were up to, and everybody's shocked and horrified. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Clearly, if 1 in 2,000 children is disappearing every year, or per year, perhaps a better way to say it, there's stuff going on. And next, a link. Religion is seen by so-called right-thinking people as irrational. And when you look at the ceremonies and some of the dogmas and doctrines, that's hard to argue with, really. Okay. But it's only irrational, really, when compared with our current scientific worldview. And one of the things we know from science is that this is probably an infinite universe, and our observable part of it is expanding, accelerating, and that is pretty certainly embedded in something much, much bigger. And the bigger universe, as far as theories go, is probably expanding rapidly too, and new bubble universes are appearing in it all the time, each of them the same but different from ours, and each of these bubble universes is probably, or quite possibly, one of an infinite number of parallel universes too. A multiverse. It's multiverses upon multiverses. In such a scenario, there is room for an infinite amount of knowledge. It can encode, if you like, an infinite amount of knowledge. So any amount of knowledge that humans will ever find in comparison to infinity is infinitesimal. It's nothing. Provably, we know almost nothing about how all this works. We know some, but we don't know how universal that knowledge is. We don't know if it changes with time. We think it doesn't, but there is evidence that it does. So religion is irrational in the context where we assume we understand how stuff works. But we know provably that we don't. And what religion essentially says is that the nature of the world is dependent upon our morality. And they'll say, if you're immoral you go to hell, and if you're good you go to heaven, and stuff like that. But it seems to me they mean it more deeply than that. They say the world depends on our morality, or God will chastise us. Another way of looking at that is, if the universe is some kind of projection of our consciousness, if consciousness is fundamental to reality, then the morality that we allow ourselves to live with may directly affect the underlying reality of the universe that we experience. And there is evidence for it. Rupert Sheldrake, in his book The Science Delusion, I think it's called something else in America, but just looking him up, Rupert Sheldrake, his theories of morphic resonance and the evidence he points to suggest that the laws of nature adapt themselves to what we're doing, interestingly, and that they may evolve with time. He gives examples of chemists coming up with new chemical substances and trying to crystallise them. And how it always seems to be very difficult to crystallise these substances for the first time and the first few times, and then when it's tried, even in laboratories elsewhere in the world, it's easier after a time. So one forecast that this idea would make is that the temperatures to cause crystals to form would have to be lower at first because it's harder to crystallise them. And indeed you get this kind of effect over time. The actual crystallizing temperature is higher, it becomes easier to do. He gives examples in his books. It's worth looking at. It does suggest that things adapt to what we do to some degree. And religion says that morality is really fundamental for our souls, as it were, whatever those things are. It seems to be undefined. But there we have a hypothesis, a scientific and testable hypothesis that would fit that. And there are other phenomena which suggest that consciousness has effects on morality, on reality. Scientists come up with, a lot of materialists object to things like psychic phenomena. We have Chris Carter's book here, Science and Psychic Phenomena. We have his Science and the Afterlife Experience. And we have Science and the Near-Death Experience. These books are talking about evidence, well-attested evidence of very strange phenomena, which don't fit in with the current paradigm, but nevertheless are well attested. And you see really retarded materialists coming up with stupid objections to this sort of stuff. Oh, it's all fake. Yeah, there's a lot of fraud in these fields. There's a lot of fraud in everything in humans. It's delusion. You've done the experiments wrong. Some of these experiments have been done by skeptics and have still produced results. Those books talk about it in quite some detail. And there are others. Dean Radin's A Conscious Universe is a good one. It's a bit dry and dull, but it goes through the stats of the experiments and shows how in some of them, when the analysis is done, the odds against it being due to chance are something like trillions to 1 against. This is better evidence than in, say, the evidence for the Higgs particle. So, a rational person will say, well, yeah, maybe there's something going on here, actually. And a rational person will not be swayed by dogmatic idiots, actually. You've got to deal with the objections. If the experiment has been done badly, of course it has to be corrected and tested and checked. But these have been, the ones these books talk about. And still the phenomena show up. And if consciousness has a direct effect upon reality, phenomena such as these would be expected, actually. So then we come to the next link in the chain. Prophecies. Mostly religious ones I'll look at. There have been prophecies going back a long way. I'll mention some of them. We have Our Lady of Salette from 1846. She talked about how all governments would become focused on materialism and the removal of civil rights so as to promote a materialist agenda. And we are living in that world now. I think it's fair to say. In effect, she was saying that laws based on religious morality would be replaced with laws based on humanism and atheism, and money, essentially. Money, of course, being the root of all evil, pretty much, as we have this saying. And we have the prophecies from Hildegard of Bingen. She was born in something like 1098 AD. We have more recent prophecies by people like Alois Irlmaier about a big war. We have the prophecies of Fatima, of course, from the early 20th century, where the third prophecy, the Vatican claims to have released the information, but there is evidence from the prophecies of Our Lady of Good Success that they haven't released all of it. Our Lady of Good Success, 1635 and onwards, made a series of prophecies about how the world would be chastised, about how the Masons would take over governments all over the world. The Freemasons. Now clearly, this was a long time ago, 1635. And nowadays, there are pictures, you can see them on the internet, of lots and lots of politicians and megastars and so on using Masonic hand signs. It's like they're everywhere. Now fine, people join the Masons because it will provide them with some business advantages, they think, and they can do some charity work, some charitable work. So yeah, the charitable work is fine. It's probably a cover-up though, isn't it? Because if you think what business advantage means, that means corruption. Actually, that's what it means, and nepotism, actually. And that's thought to be okay. So right at the start, the reason for joining is to get a personal advantage. And these people are everywhere throughout the governments of the world now. Now you can see them in their photos doing their hand signs, and sometimes, if you look them up, there are common ones like the hand on the chest or the hand inside the jacket. There's some other ones. Obviously, there are photos of people doing these things which are just accidental hand gestures being used against them. We don't know, really. But I think we know pretty well that our governments are subverted pretty much totally towards materialistic ends. And that they clearly are not respecting human rights and civil rights anymore. And Our Lady of La Salette said that the governments would delete civil rights, would be focused on materialism, and that the world would be full of atheistic priests, or humanistic priests if you like. And yes, you can hear some of them talk. They'll use psychological symbolism rather than religious symbolism. They are not believers anymore, and many Anglican priests have openly admitted that they're atheists, indeed, and that they think the story of Jesus is just a metaphor, it never happened, and so on. Okay, whether it is or isn't, these people are not what they purport to be. Our Lady of Good Success also talked about the chastisement, as did Alois Irlmaier, I think is a 19th century prophet, not particularly a religious one, about a huge war, 3 days of darkness. Several prophets have talked about that when it happens, and if you look outside even, you will die on the spot. If you go outside, you certainly will. The flooding and destruction of England, most of the country gone when it happens. Northern Europe too. northern Germany anyway, I believe. And the warnings were that this would happen if people did not live morally, virtuously, and indeed believe in those religions, which I find hard to do. I'm a kind of a secular person, right? So perhaps I'm doomed. I don't know. I hope not. I think one has to look at these things because a lot of the prophecies of these people have actually already happened. And they are well attested. They definitely happened before these times. And one of them, and I forget which one, said that the Great Chastisement, when it came, it wouldn't come in the 1800s, it wouldn't come in the 1900s. If it came in the 2000s, or in the 20th century, rather, it would be towards the end of the 20th century. If it didn't happen in the 20th century, it would definitely happen in the 21st century, and that's where we are now. Okay. As I mentioned before in videos, it might be worth just becoming a bit of a prepper, just in case. Because some of these things are coming true. We haven't had the big war yet. But we are seeing the world going in the way that was forecast, long before it was easily visible. Other things that were suggested was that the chastisement would really go on for as much as 35 years. Religious people would be persecuted. And again, the end of civil rights. And I think the SJWs and so on are deliberately being used to do this sort of thing. And what conclusions can we draw from this, really? Given that it's rational to accept that we don't know everything, we have to rely on what we know. But we must also rely on the fact that we know that we don't know much. I think a conclusion is that morality relates to values, and a society with only materialist values is not good. And morality probably does affect the kind of reality that we live in. Indeed, a society in which people are moral, have good morals, would obviously be a better society to live in. And the other side of that coin is that a morality that permits license is in fact an amorality. By definition, really. And that we are being moved quite rapidly now into an amoral society, and therefore, based on the evidence and hypothesis, the evidence of the psychic stuff perhaps, and the prophecies, and the hypothesis of morphic resonance and things of that sort, that may directly affect the nature of reality and what the universe reflects to us in our consciousness. So get ready for it, I think. What do you think? Is this completely irrational nonsense? I want you to check the data first, though. It's no good just dogmatically saying this is nonsense. That's irrational. Okay. Bye for now.